Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Ambassador for the Red Flag Group, and I'd like to welcome you to Compliance Into the Weeds, a podcast with Tom Fox and Matt Kelly, where we go deep into the weeds of a particular compliance issue. And today, we do just that. We take a look at SOX 404 reporting requirements, SOX 302 disclosure requirements, and the gap between the publishing of an earnings release and the filing of a quarterly report. We really geek out on what it might mean for the SOX 404 compliance expert and professional and the anti-corruption compliance expert. We then take a look at the COSO ERM Framework and discuss it in context with the COSO 2013 framework and the government public sector's call for an amalgamation, merging, or unity of these two frameworks. Matt and I talk about what it might mean for the compliance practitioner and how this might come to pass. And I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion because we even have a citation from the Ministry of Finance in China who wants to see this happen. So when the Chinese government and the U.S. government agree on an internal controls framework, I think the compliance world needs to sit up and listen. This is a little bit longer episode coming in at nearly 30 minutes. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds with my good friend and colleague, Matt Kelly. Matt, welcome.
Hello, Tom. Always good to be here.
Matt, you continue to go into the weeds, and you really went into the weeds on one recent blog post. And I think I'm just going to have to let you explain this because, frankly, this is so into the weeds. It's close to my limit, but the blog post is entitled Of SOX Controls and Earning Reports. And what you write about is a gap between the publishing of earnings releases and subsequent quarterly reports. So why don't you kind of walk us through all this and what you see as its significance?
Sure. Well, I will be the first to say that this subject is more near and dear to the hearts of those of you who are really involved in SOX compliance and internal control over financial reporting. If there are any internal auditors listening to this podcast, you will feel at home because you guys probably deal with this more than some of the lawyer types who might be more involved in corporate compliance, although corporate secretaries, who are technically in charge of filing SEC documents and whatnot, they too might be interested in this. So I was looking at a study published by friends I know at a data research firm called CalcBench, and they were looking at the gap between when a company publishes its earnings releases and when it then files its formal quarterly report that backs up all of those earnings numbers the release might have said some earlier time. All they wanted to do with CalcBench was just see what's the difference between filing your 8K when you say, here's our release, things are great, isn't this wonderful? How many days between that and then a couple of days later when you might file your 10Q, the quarterly report that says, here's all of our numbers and all the other disclosures that we typically file every quarter. And so what CalcBench found was that if you file your 8K relatively soon after a quarter ends, then you have a longer time gap until you file your quarterly report later. And if you actually delay your earnings release from the quarter end, the longer you delay it, the more likely you are to file these both documents at the same time, or even on the same day or simultaneously. So that was the geeky part, the data part of it. If you want to look at the data, it's on my blog, radicalcompliance.com. I've got a nice chart looking at that. I've got a nice graph that shows clearly there are some people who bolt out of the gate right after quarter end and say, here's our earnings release. And then time passes, and finally, and here's our 10Q. And there are others who are kind of like the hare versus the tortoise. They come along instead of 2 or 3 weeks after the quarter end, they'll come along more than a month after the quarter end saying, here's our earnings release, and here's the quarterly report all at once, via con Dios. We only looked at the data in the second quarter of 2016, but that's the gap that they found.
But this, this is simply beyond just number cruncher guys crunching numbers for the sake of crunching numbers. You raised some really interesting questions around Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, and I guess my takeaway, or at least my starting point, perhaps, would be if there's SOX compliance issues, is it a broader compliance issue? So why don't you maybe start with the SOX compliance and tell us at least some of the questions you think this raises?
Yeah, and it raises a few questions, and we should stress right here that all I can do on this podcast and with this post is raise some questions, because CalcBench and I may do a deeper dive into the data, but we don't have many answers yet. But what is interesting is that Section 404 of SOX, the one that we all panicked about when SOX was first passed 10 years ago, or 15 years ago now, Section 404 is about your financial reporting controls. And those are really the important ones, about that the earnings numbers you disclose to investors, they're accurate. That's what 404 controls are. 302, Section 302 of Sarbanes-Oxley says all the other stuff you also need to disclose every quarter in a quarterly report. All of your 302 controls work so you can gather up all that other stuff that isn't pure financial reporting, but it is still useful to investors. What I'm wondering is, does this gap between the earnings release and the full quarterly report, could that be because some companies find that their 404 controls work very well, so you can shove the earnings release out early, but your 302 controls are working less well, they're more complicated, you have got different procedures, maybe you have a different system, I don't know, but that takes longer, so you can't shove the quarterly report out with all of the disclosure controls also there. And could you maybe revisit all of your SOX controls? Could you consolidate them into one system? And would that perhaps lead you to file both documents a little bit earlier? Maybe not necessarily right out of the gate, but not necessarily more than a month later, where you might file both at the same time. It's an interesting question. What we don't know here is how many companies that maybe filed the 10Q relatively late may or may not have also disclosed 302 problems. If that was the case, that would really be a big sign that, some companies have overdosed on Section 404 so you can get the earnings release out early, but you're still weak on Section 302, which is why your quarterly report doesn't get out for nearly 2 weeks later. And in the investing world, that's a lot of time. It's some interesting stuff there that gets to the accuracy of your financial systems, who does run your SOX compliance, how much is it embedded into your business processes, how much is it all automated, which would mean it's faster, or is it still manual, which is a big headache for a lot of people and can take a lot of time. So you really, for the SOX compliance people who are out there, who often don't even have the word compliance in their title. They have internal audit in their title. But for those people, this study would be interesting. It'd make you wonder, why is that? And I don't know why that is, but that's one of my pet projects for the next couple of weeks, is to see if we can maybe answer some of these questions about what works and what doesn't work.
Well, then let me throw out some additional questions that you might think about that you raised for me in describing that. First of all, if your disclosure controls are weaker, are they weaker by a factor of materiality, so that even with robust and strong financial reporting controls or financial controls as governed by 404, if your disclosure controls are materially weak and your auditors gives you a pass on that, is that a problem with the auditing standard? Can you then conversely, can you have a material weakness in your disclosure controls and still have robust financial controls under Section 404? I guess that's kind of the first general area of inquiry. Second is the SEC, I think, has been very aggressive in its both data mining and enforcement actions around both types of controls, both disclosure controls and financial controls. And by having this gap of time, does that alone signal to the SEC that they need to investigate a company vis-a-vis its disclosure controls, even if they accept the financial controls are adequate and meet the SEC's requirements under 404? And then finally, moving to where I kind of intersect with internal controls in the anti-corruption compliance space is the strength of your financial controls going to have any bearing on whether or not your compliance internal controls are strong enough to sustain an FCPA investigation, because the SEC has publicly announced they are data mining financial controls reporting as required under 404 from the FCPA perspective. So if you have this gap in length of time, is the SEC going to draw any conclusions from that alone, or is there some other inference that the SEC would draw? I don't pretend to know the answers really to any of those questions, but from the information you and your friends at Cowbench have put out, I think you raise some really interesting areas for exploration.
That last part is probably most accurate, is that we've raised some areas for exploration, and I can take some of your questions in relative order. So the very first one about what's the difference between a material weakness in Section 404 and 302. 302 controls are not audited in the same way that Section 404 controls are. If you have a material weakness in your 404 controls, you're basically telling investors we can't rely on the accuracy of our financial statements. You have a material weakness in 404, that's a big deal. It doesn't look good. We had a lot of that in 2004, 05, 06 when SOX was first passed. And then 404 controls have been cleaned up quite a bit over the last decade or so. So you see that less often. One of the great questions in accounting right now is whether that's because companies really have cleaned up their internal controls for financial reporting, or do we simply think that, but we have other weaknesses we haven't quite grasped yet? And the SEC goes back and forth on this. The Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, which regulates audit firms, that's gone back and forth on, are we finding enough mistakes in Section 404? And we could talk about that for hours on end, so I'll put that aside. Section 302 controls are not audited in the same way that 404 controls are. I think, and this is me just going off the top of my head, you could have material weaknesses in your 302 controls would simply make you look really bad to investors. I don't think that the SEC would necessarily be suing you over that or you would wind up with big restatements, but you would wind up more with, like, I'll take one example. A disclosure control for 302 is all of your directors, have you had any resignations or new directors in the last quarter? Like if you forget that, oh yeah, we had 2 directors resign this quarter. Oops, our bad. We'll file that as amended 302 disclosure later on. Like that just looks dumb. That's a preposterous example, but it gives you a flavor of what is at issue there. Your third question, all right, I give up. What was your third question again? I know there was the second one and the third one. The third one about what might this say about your anti-corruption controls?
Right.
That is really going to depend almost on a case-by-case basis of what the problems are, specifically around anti-corruption controls, because you could conceivably have very strong FCPA controls. You could have great books and records, but if the company fully documents that it's paying a bribe, you've still violated the criminal provisions of the FCPA, and the Justice Department is still in your case. There are probably going to be so many individual permutations of how you could or couldn't have this problem arise that I don't know that we could make too many generalized statements about it. But I think, the key for most companies is going to be, are your 404 controls over financial reporting, are they strong? If they're strong, you've got good ground to stand on. If they're weak, you've got problems and uncertainty all over the place, including around your anti-corruption controls, because, frankly, a lot of anti-corruption controls are about books and records. That's where companies get tripped up, and then suddenly the can of worms is open. I would worry about those much more than I'd worry about 302 controls. The other part of FCPA is just, is somebody actually paying a bribe? That's more a problem of training, policy management, and whatnot, plus effective internal control over financial reporting, which is Section 404. If you're going to sketch out a triangle of what to worry about, 302 I would probably put closer to the bottom, as opposed to just effective control environment, good policies, good training and whatnot, and really locked down corporate accounting over questionable payments. Somebody's trying to gussy up and the accounting department misses it. And then I have to admit, I forget what the second question you had there was.
The second question dealt with not so much the materiality, but the effect of weakened or weaker disclosure controls around what that might say about the types of anti-corruption controls that you just talked about. So I think actually my questions 2 and 3 blended together, and I think your response blended into an answer for both.
Yeah. I would maybe add on that we should always be aware a few different weaknesses that aren't necessarily material, but, if they're in the same realm of, what kind of weaknesses you have, a couple of little cracks in the system can add up to a much weaker system generally. Just because you have an absence of one big material weakness somewhere, people should not be thinking, oh, I got no problems. No, if you have multiple deficiencies, that can still speak to larger headaches when you look at them in the whole. And I know that's one thing that the PCAOB thinks about from time to time. And, there are headaches like that people should keep in mind.
And maybe we can end this section, Matt, with really the larger picture for me from this blog post and your description thereof in this podcast is the way you can use data, which becomes information. And by slicing and dicing it in very different ways, you've come up with, or CalcBench has come up with, some very interesting questions. The questions that they and you and others will explore going forward, and it may give us some information that we didn't have before that we can then utilize in our full circle of feedback loop so that we can improve the 404 and 302 reporting. So to me, from the anti-corruption compliance practitioner perspective, it shows the power of data analysis and transaction analysis to give you different ways to look at things that might provide either issues for remediation or perhaps even opportunities that could be exploited in other areas.
I wholly agree. CalcBench didn't even specifically publish this data for the purposes of our discussion here. They were doing this for one of their institutional clients who just wanted to know, more from an investment perspective, which companies tend to be quick on the draw and which ones tend to, deliver both things at once. It wasn't until I looked at the data I realized that there were some SOX implications here. We could ask some questions, and it gets to some interesting ideas about what's the technology people might use for SOX compliance and whatnot. And we can talk about that a different day if we want, but there's plenty to go on here.
So if we could do what now we all know is the pivot to a second blog post you've had, I think went up today, entitled ERM Framework, Government Sector Calls for Unity. And when I read your opening paragraph, I was a little concerned when you started off with one of the sleeper issues, I thought we were going to go down a rabbit trail that perhaps might be negative. But actually, I found the information you put out and your argument calming, if not positive. So why don't you tell us about the COSO ERM Framework, COSO 2013, and what the government call for unity is all about?
Sure. So I know that devout listeners of our podcast might remember earlier this summer, you and I talked. Oh, we've got plenty of devout listeners out there. Come on. We had an earlier podcast about COSO's draft framework for enterprise risk management. It is revising its ERM framework, which is sorely needed and a very welcome news. It is revising its ERM framework now, hoping to publish a final new ERM framework next year. And the comment period for its draft just closed on September 30th. So I took a look at some of those comments that people had submitted to the COSO about the new framework. What really jumped out to me was that voices in the federal government who have their own requirements for good ERM and internal controls as government agencies, the U.S. government spends and takes in a lot of money, and it has a lot of its own internal compliance and risk management goals. The feds really wanted COSO to work more on a framework that connects risk management with internal control. And if you are a compliance officer, even in the private sector, publicly traded companies have to use some sort of framework for internal control to document all of their Section 404 work we just talked about. And they use the COSO Framework for Internal Control that came out in 2013. So it's very interesting that suddenly the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the Association of Enterprise Risk Managers for Federal Agencies, I did not know there was such an association, but there is. Both of them were saying, we love the framework, but we would like the ERM framework to be much more clearly connected to the internal control framework. Now, they said that because the federal government is embarking on a big effort to implement ERM at all federal agencies in this fiscal year. This is going to be the first time they figure out how to do it, where all of their risk management principles will be connected to specific internal controls, because they've done their own version of SOX compliance for years, several years now at least. But they're really trying to get at integrated ERM and internal control, and they're trying to do it ahead of the private sector. So clearly they're asking COSO to, hey, help us out, do us a solid, and come up with some way to connect these two frameworks, possibly even someday in the future, another framework that does treat them both as one single consolidated thing. We don't know how COSO is going to respond to that, but it was interesting to see that the federal agencies are clearly asking for this sort of a unified treatment of internal control and risk management, which is not anything we're really hearing all that much about on the corporate side of life.
Well, and I guess the question it brought up for me as I got to the end of your article, Matt, is do you see this as a direction that the private sector could go, either led by the government or kind of in conjunction with the government? Because having a unified framework might make things quite a bit simpler, if not one or two less diagrams.
That is an excellent point, which in fact was made in a comment letter from, of all groups, the Chinese Ministry of Finance, which submitted its own comment letter, and it was very thoughtful, where they said, basically, both frameworks are very good, but if you have two frameworks, would not that increase the chance there might be two separate efforts at risk management and internal control that are not on the same page within the same company? Yes, the Chinese Ministry of Finance is correct. That is a very possible sort of a trap that a company might fall into. If we all keep on saying that good internal control is one part of enterprise risk management, which we all say as we're all talking about best practices, then should we not have some sort of co-equal or integrated or cohesive approach to the frameworks for these things so that you are not duplicating your efforts? That is what the federal government here in the United States would like to do with its new ERM program. How are they going to do that? I don't know that many federal agencies have figured that out yet. They are supposed to figure it out in fiscal 2017, which is we are now in, so that it can be up and running by fiscal 2018, which will start in roughly 12 months. I would be very curious to see how they do that. And I think it is a good idea, because you could wind up having some internal control efforts that are duplicative to enterprise risk management, or possibly even run counter to what ERM wants to do. I like the idea of ERM as setting the range of acceptable performance within a business process, and internal control is the guide rail on either side of that range so that you don't bounce in or out of it, but you can bounce back and forth between it. That's my metaphor. COSO has not adopted it yet, but I think that that sort of approach is very good and very thoughtful. Some companies are definitely trying to do that. We should say the federal government, not the SEC, not COSO, not anybody, is suggesting that we mandate this. It's just the feds are trying this exercise on their own, and while they are not exactly like corporations, they do have a lot of similar large enterprise problems. So I'm looking forward to see how they might solve it. Will COSO give them some extra guidance to help them out? If they did, I think corporate compliance officers would be very wise to look at what the final version might be and whether or not that could be something they could use in trying to integrate their own efforts, which is a good idea.
Well, I guess as my English wife might suggest, we should watch this space and see what happens.
We absolutely should. It should be an interesting time. Like I said, this is a sleeper issue this year, but COSO's framework is going to be out by next summer. It will be very curious to see what the final draft looks like and what extra help COSO might give to federal agencies. Might there be things we could beg, borrow, and steal here in the corporate world for our own ends?
Well, Matt, as always, it's been a fascinating conversation as we've gone into the weeds and geeked out quite a bit. And I would say for all the devotees out there, we are not men, we are Devo, if you'll recall that reference. So, but with that, could you tell people how to get in contact with you via email if they wanted to follow up with you directly on anything we've talked about?
Yeah, sure. All of these posts I mentioned are on my blog at radicalcompliance.com, and they can just find me at mkelly, spelled Kelly, mkelly at radicalcompliance.com too.
Matt, as always, thanks a lot, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
All right, Tom. Take care.